Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to another episode of Verta Stars Podcast 4th season. How my loyal listeners, thank you for continued support. This is an amazing episode because B. Claymore boards the mothership to discuss the last flight out of Wichita from DSTLRY. Now come on board and go traversing the stars. Hi, Mr. Clay. Thank you for the Traverse the Stars podcast.
Thank you for having me, Jeff.
So my pleasure. So I always start off with a question of inspiration. So inspire your love for comics and who your earliest influences.
Okay. Well, I moved around a lot as a kid, and when I landed in a certain place around fourth grade, and the guys that I got to know there were reading comics. Actually, one of them had a much older brother who had a basement full of comics dating back to the 60s that he wouldn't let us touch most of the time. And then another friend had been collecting since he was very young. So these guys had all these crazy back issues, and I'd always read. And one of the things when I moved around a lot is, you spend a lot of time alone when you land in new places, so you bring what you can with you. And for me, it was books and then comics and music. So those guys got me like it was a whole new world of stuff I'd never heard of. Like people talk about how confusing continuity and everything is, which now it's a nightmare. But at the time, I remember picking up like an issue of the X-Men or Legion of Superheroes and seeing all these crazy characters in the middle of a story that I had no idea what was going on. And instead of being confused, like this obsessive nature of my personality, I really wanted to go back and figure out who all these characters were. It was a lot easier then than it is now. This is early 80s. But and for whatever reason, it just like once I got into it, I just had to any comic book I could find. It wasn't just superheroes. It wasn't. I mean, if I found an old, Donald Duck comic or Charlton Brothers of the Spear or whatever, I look back now and I had like no discerning taste. I would just read anything. So having been a reader and I drew, I was an artist. I feel like maybe as far back as like fifth grade, I thought I wanted, like a lot of writers, I was initially a frustrated artist. So yeah, it's hard to pin comic book influences down, except that I think because I had immediately jumped into the whole world of comics. I mean, I remember finding like the first old Overstreet price guides I found. You would flip through and they'd have these middle sections full of color comics from like the 40s and 50s and 60s. And I mean, like my mind was blown by the whole experience, and I was fascinated by the whole history. So I think people who are in comics that are only influenced primarily by comics are at a disadvantage. I do think it was an advantage that I didn't like zero in on one thing specifically. Although the old like John Byrne and Chris Claremont X-Men, Terry Austin, that stuff really fired my imagination. So there's a lot of influence there, I'm sure. In terms of writing, by the time I actually decided, so I was a journalism major in school, and I was, as I said, I was always an artist, but like when I was taking like advanced art courses, like in high school, I was more interested in kind of hanging out with girls and doodling around. And there were these nerds in the corner that had their heads down and were just killing it. And I just remember thinking, I don't think I have the focus that these guys do to get that much better. So in college, I did do a comic strip that I wrote and drew a little bit. I was following a journalism path, but at some point when I wasn't in journalism or comics, a friend of mine just said, "Why don't you just write comics? Like it's that easy." But I'd already always screwed around with them. So by that point, like Warren Ellis with like Stormwatch and James Robinson, Starman, Grant Morrison, Animal Man, and all that stuff. That was a few years earlier, but those books kind of made me realize that you could really tell smart, interesting stories using genre, which hadn't really been done I don't think until Alan Moore did Swamp Thing here, did people realize or start attempting to use these kind of cheesy genre trappings to tell smart, intelligent stories. And that really excited me. So, if I'm going to point to direct influence, it would be guys that I discovered later in life, but I would point to James Robinson and Starman specifically.
That's a great series.
Yeah. And the thing about that is like I've since become pretty good friends with James and Tony Harris and I created the Whistling Skull at DC that we did a new version of last year. There's a point where I kind of had to step back and kind of appreciate that the guys who really influenced me the most and kind of led me down this path for better or worse became friends and collaborators. And actually, James actually reached out to me initially, and like there was a early period where I was so flattered by James's appreciation of my work. I mean, to this day, I'll hear from him occasionally, and he'll always mention how much he likes what I do. And I was flattered until I realized that like we have the exact same influences, and like we're I think he does it better than I do, but it's like we're kind of trying to do the same thing. And it was at a certain point I realized, oh, it's flattering to have one of your idols appreciate what you do, but also we're kind of trying to do the same thing all the time. So at least it connects on that level. But um, beyond those guys, though, to be honest with you, more direct influences on what I try to do are like film and music, oddly enough. Um, like this new series we're doing at DSTLRY, Last Flight Out of Wichita, is very influenced by sort of 70s kind of harder edged crime noir, like neo noir. I think that was kind of the golden age for smart genre storytelling without a lot of frills and trappings. So, yeah, I mean, I draw from whatever I can, but it was a longer answer than you asked for. But
no, it's fantastic. And James Robson's one of my bucket list interviews. So no, I think that's absolutely awesome.
I'll drop him a line. I mean,
I greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, he's got a couple new books that he just sent me that I need to respond to about, but I'll mention that I talked to you.
When you've been able to talk to them, are you talking like about the business of comic books and how they develop ideas, or is it or do you not talk shop when you're talking to these people as on the friend level?
That's a great question. So I have a pretty tight network of creators that I'm in communication with frequently. Like a larger group of which a smaller portion of us kind of communicate online regularly. And the conversations, I mean, they will always loop back around mainly to the business of comics. Of course, we talk about, films and music and, like LA is on fire right now and, things like that. But the conversations, I would say lately, they've been a lot about the market and people have different opinions of where the market is right now. Like, I think I'm super excited. I think the market's in a better place than it's ever been for creators. And that I understand the direct market has its struggles. But I'm of the belief that if the industry as a whole outside the direct market does well, the direct market will feed off that, which I don't think a lot of people in the direct market believe. But I mean, I don't think most of us, or a lot of us, especially, Generation X or, just after that, most of us didn't discover comics in a comic book shop, right? I mean, when I was a kid, I lived in Iowa as a kid, and the local college had a bookstore that had comics in it. They would put them out every Thursday. And so we would ride our bikes up to the bookstore every Thursday, and we would pick and choose. I was an X-Men guy, this guy was an Avengers guy, Fantastic Four guy, whatever. And then if we couldn't afford a few issues, we'd hide them behind magazines that we didn't think, to the point where I remember the lady who ran the bookstore complaining that we were always hiding comics behind other magazines. But the point is, that's where we got our fix. And then when I moved to Dallas as a kid, I knew comic shop. I think I'd been to Mile High, maybe in Denver. But I remember when we moved to Dallas, I had made my mom take me to Lone Star Comics, which was and then, and I guess still is, one of the bigger shops. And that's where just, it was like my mind was blown. And then I found a local in fact, one of my best friends happened to live within walking distance of the comic shop. So, I would visit him and badger him until we could go. So, I mean, comic shops obviously, that's where I discovered most of the interesting stuff I read. The point is, I only was interested in a comic shop because I had already fallen in love with comics. So, if you are reading comics, you're going to Barnes and Noble or wherever, and you're reading graphic novels and stuff, and you're really interested in them, and you're aware that there's a comic book shop within proximity, your next, if you're probably not going to go back to Barnes and Noble if you know there's a comic book shop close. Although Barnes and Nobles have, a lot of Barnes and Nobles have better comic sections than comic book shops, which is another problem. But anyway, I'm rambling, but that's kind of been on my mind lately, is just sort of how to diversify where the books are available and how to get them into more people's hands. Because even if the market seems like it's really not in a downturn, but people always ever, I mean, since I started buying and writing and, working in comics, the market's always been down, even when it's going up. It's just like this
Mhm.
self-hating prophecy they have about the industry. I mean, and people want to argue. This is what I don't understand too. There's like a whole group of people out there. Their whole goal is to argue and point out that comics are dying. Like people who supposedly love comics. And of course, usually it's because they have comics they love that they don't think there are enough of, and they think that's why people aren't reading, which is straight up bullshit. Um, but the point is, I see comics reaching other markets and demographics, and we've done all right in comics with a very small portion of a large readership pie. Even if readership is on the decline, if you got your comic book into 2% of readers' hands, you would make more money than God, right? So
Right.
I think people don't think about the specific circumstance they're in. Like they focus too much on this larger picture.
Mm.
So maybe readership is down, and even if the comic market heads down, we're still not reaching nearly enough of the potential readership that will always be out there because people aren't going to stop reading. So for me, that's a conversation we've had a lot recently. As my friend Jeremy Hahn and collaborator and Philip Sablique and Jamie Rich have just launched this Ignition Press, which has been in the works for a long time. Um, you
Well,
know,
then Jimmy Hahn's a friend of the show, and well, just to add on what you're saying though, I feel like we are seeing the best growth of this third tier combo companies like Mad Cave, and then you have Dynamite and Distilleries we're going to talk about in a bit, that we've had in a long time, probably since the 90s when everything was exploding out. And so when you're thinking of something like, say, Lake Distillery, right? You have worked for probably so many different small companies and things of that nature, and also the big two and everything else in between. Um, when you're thinking of something like Distillery, how are you looking at a company for longevity, from a business plan standpoint? Are you looking at them and thinking this is a company that will be here 10 years, so I want my combo connected to them? And also, we're talking also like there's ones also like Magna Comics and like other ones that in that same kind of vicinity. And why are you choosing one versus another?
that's another good question. That's definitely part of the equation. So for me, I got into the industry as a writer almost 20 years ago. I worked briefly full time for Image. Image is where the first thing I ever did was with Jay Torres, who's a writer at Slave Labor Graphics, which was a small anthology, but that got me acquainted with enough people and familiar enough with the industry and Diamond and all that to sort of understand how things work. Then Image was the first place where I did Hawaiian Dick initially, and then a number of projects. The first few years in the industry, there was a period where I was doing work for DC quite a bit and still doing some creator owned stuff, and then after several years in the industry, my pace slowed down to the point where for a while I was kind of doing about a book a year, and it was always be a creator owned book. I'd always have things in the works. Within the last year or two, actually, when COVID hit is when I kind of stepped back and said, I've got to redirect my focus because all I want to do full time is write comics and deal with stuff beyond that. Um, so I stepped back and kind of took a breath because I got sidetracked working for DC doing like trying, you chase. It's really mainly about the paycheck and some false notion of prestige. I don't think there is prestige attached to creators who work at DC or Marvel now unless they establish themselves either as like the workhorse. Like Jason Aaron is a local writer I've known Jason since long before he was since before he was a comic book writer. But a guy like that who has carried Marvel on his shoulders to a large extent, that's great. He has options and readers that'll follow him.
Hmm.
But the average, I couldn't name the average Marvel or DC writer, which isn't not to slight them, but it's just like product that gets churned out all the time. So I kind of bristle at the notion that people want that as their destination or their goal, because there's no long-term future writing for Marvel or DC unless you become one of those guys, or if you do work there, that will at least open doors for you where people will listen to you to do your own work, which I think that's where career sustainability and also ultimately financially, but creatively, I mean, having control of what you do is just. So I got sidetracked working for DC. Then you get pigeonholed as this guy or that guy because you'll take what you might try to do something that's close to your sensibilities, but then all of a sudden, especially when I was at DC with Dan DiDio, it was very clear that he had very limited perceptions of what I couldn't do. But I would keep doing some of those little, retro things or this or that. And then I started doing like Nike and basically the modern version of Hostess Twinkies comics. And boy, that doesn't, then you're that guy. And and it's almost like if you're adaptable enough to do anything they give you pretty well, if they give you some crazy shit that they don't want to do more of, they think, oh, that's what he does because he does that well, right? Which is all to say that I realized I got to get off this treadmill, because it's not even what I love doing to begin with. Even at Valiant or DC, a Wildstorm, places like that were work for hire, I was very often creating my own characters. I mean, like I created a book at Wildstorm with an original character. I brought Savage to Valiant whole cloth, which is now a Valiant character. The next thing I did at Valiant was another new concept. And I'm fine with that. I mean, I understand that when I create something, it's now theirs, even if there's some equity involved. But why am I creating things for people who now own it? And not only that, tell me how to, change it. And then once they have it in their hands, we'll do some stupid shit with it, right? So yeah, but because I've been in the industry so long, because it's maintaining personal relationships is very important to me on a personal level and on a creative level and on a professional level. Most of the people you meet in the industry will end up here or there or there or there, right? So doors are open everywhere, right? So it's almost irresponsible of me as somebody who has that opportunity and loves to create not to take advantage of it. There's so many people that would love to be in that position. So I'll step back and I'll see, who's working where that I know, what are they doing? For me, I don't want to work for a company that's churning out garbage, even if they're churning out good stuff, because maybe that's short-sighted. I mean, if somebody's going to pay you a bunch of money and you do something good, maybe that's not that big a deal. But for me, there's so much about guilt by association. And I mean, like I've known nice guys who run companies that publish a lot of stuff, and I just think it's kind of trashy to I mean, if people enjoy it, that's fine and everything, but the perception of it is not, and especially among creators, And so I remember specifically a guy, because I'd helped him out earlier, offering, do whatever you want here and this and that. And then I looked at all the books they're doing and the perception, and I'm like, I don't want to, because I started at Image and then kind of went right into DC.
Yeah.
And from there, I worked at Wildstorm. I did, I mean, everybody, I mean, the only company I haven't done like much for that's kind of established at all is like Dark Horse, maybe. I mean, I've had 2 books there that I was going to do. And, but I always tried to work at companies that had some respect within the industry. And because you've seen, everybody can see this. You've seen creators that were like here. And then all of a sudden you see they're doing something and your first thought is, what? Why? Your thought isn't, oh, maybe they have the freedom or this or that. You're like, oh my God, is that the only place that'll, right? So there's that consideration. Because it's creator owned, ownership is a big consideration. And I wouldn't complain about anybody's deal, but everybody has different deals in terms of what they'll pay you, what they'll advance you, what the royalties will be, what the ownership split would be, what the control of the media rights would be. So not that everybody's going to accept nobody really gets to go here, publish this, or, just get, but you'll pitch something to somebody specifically because of the relationship or the deal or what you need at the time. And if they approve it, then you've got to make the determination if you're going to do that or not. Um, I've done books for good money that I knew I was going to give up control of media rights, even if I would always get a percentage of it, which is to say they would then control where it goes or whatever. Because the first book I created on my own was Hawaiian Dick, and it was immediately optioned by New Line, which was a shock to me at the time. But it was, when you get that first big option check, you realize, oh, this is part of the, because I mean, that's a book I never would I have thought that would attract media interest. And 20 years later, I still have people asking about it. Patrick Wilson did an interview last year after one of his Conjuring movies or whatever it is came out. And the guy asked him, what if there were any comic books he wanted to think about directing, and he had just directed his first movie. And like all of a sudden I had all these people emailing, and he kind of stops and he goes, "There is. Have you ever heard of Hawaiian Dick?" And I'm like the co-creator's mother from Australia sent me an email, "Oh, is there any chance?" And I'm like, so the point is, once you get into that part of that's part of the business too. Don't pretend like people complain about books that, oh, it looks like a movie pitch. Well, yeah, if it just seems like a pitch of any kind, it's bad. But if it reads like a movie, it's not bad. I mean, there's a reason it all translates. But as a creator doing creator-owned work, you've got to have consideration for media. Because and that's another thing, people will say, oh, they're not doing this or that. But that has sustained me a lot over the years in different projects is money I've made from options. So, yeah, like during COVID, I was working for someone who paid me regularly and kept me working during COVID when a lot of companies weren't doing that. I conceded some things that I might not have in another deal, but being paid well, doing what I wanted to do for somebody who was publishing me and kept me afloat during COVID, that's a great deal. Specifically, you probably, I do, my ADHD has me round questions, but because that's very much my thought, concern, and focus these days. DSTLRY was an example of, and another thing I'll say is, like, when Bad Idea, DSTLRY, these new companies come out and they're trying different things, the response from everybody is always immediately negative, even in creators, which I just don't get it, again, because I think we really need to do things differently to see how it works. The thing I was going to say about Ignition earlier is, Philip they've been using this, do comics differently as like their focus. That doesn't specifically mean anything, but at least they're not, at least that they're not just going to try to follow in footsteps, and, they're not, like, some of these companies are seeded by outside money. They're not just going to try to produce a bunch of IP and do whatever, right? Now, that company is founded in part by a producer that I've known for years. And you could say, oh, he's a Hollywood guy, but he brought in Jamie Rich and Philip Sablique, who are literally the two guys at the top of the list when years ago he was like, well, who would, like Philip, who basically built Boom. God bless Ross Ritchie, but Philip is the guy who turned Boom into what it became. And I've known Philip since he was at Diamond, and then he went to Top Cow, one of the smartest minds in terms of business and comics. And then Jamie Rich, who was an editor at Dark Horse, then Oni, then DC, then, wherever. Again, just, they brought in the right people to do that. So you're dealing with two segments, right? You've got a guy who's active in Hollywood, but he's got the comic book people in. That's the way to do it. So DSTLRY for me was, I knew Chip Mosher had started the company. He'd been at Comixology before that. I met Chip 20 some years ago when he was working for Oni Press, handling media, and we've maintained a relationship. I like the guy, we're friends, but we talked at Comixology. I saw he was at DSTLRY, didn't know anything else about it, but I also saw that they were, right out of the gate, the creators involved were top tier, top-notch creators, not just in terms of popularity, but in terms of aesthetics and, just talent. And I also knew enough of them personally that I knew they weren't going to jump on board a sinking ship or jump on a deal that wasn't going to be good for them, right? When you see Scott Snyder, and then you see Tula Late, and then you see, Jamie McKelvey, who I've known since he was a teenager, uh, Brian Azzarello. Well, these guys aren't just going to jump into a bad deal, right? So right away, I'm not even sure Chip's going to talk to me, but I touch base with him and then I said, and then he explained what they do to me, not what they do to me, but he explained to me what they do. And if you've seen, so I've got a pile of their books here, right? Their books are, they're magazine size with square binding. They're oversized. They're 45 pages. Just the production work and the love that goes into making the books themselves um, is evident, right? So if the if they treat creators well, and they absolutely do, and if they're partnering with you but leaning on your, like, they do a bunch of variant covers. They've got a very active sort of different variant cover scheme, but they come to us, and who do you want to see do this? What about these guys? Everything's done in conjunction, so that it's always going to reflect either your sensibility or at least something that you're. So if you're being treated fair and being paid well and on time, check, check. Royalties, check. Bookstore, check. Hardcover, check. Softcover, check. Specific targeting to comic markets with specific editions, check. That's literally, to me, like a blueprint of what I keep telling people I want to see people do, right? So we pitched this book to Chip, and it's also a smaller operation, which I appreciate. There's not a big committee. That's a consideration. There are publishers I won't even go to because I can't stand their approval process. They have a committee of media guys. They have to have 6 editors agree. It's just convoluted, and it doesn't produce the best work. Like, if you tell me right away that we have to run it by our media guys first, you're not producing the best comics. You're producing what people talk about. Oh, it's a great idea for IP, right? Well, I want it to work as a comic book before there are any considerations for IP. What I've discovered is that if you do really cool comics with a unique idea, even if it doesn't seem likely to get picked up by TV or film, it will get interest from those people. Hawaiian Dick's the best example of that. The book is called Hawaiian Dick. I mean, it's set in the 50s with ghosts and detectives and shit. It's like, that's not a recipe to turn Hollywood on, but it was immediately re-optioned by a major studio. NBC optioned it at one point. But then I would have, like, companies that were trying to just create IP come in, and they'd tell you, well, that title can't work. It's too crazy. So they'd be like, here's a suggested title, which sounds like every other title of every movie, right? So to me, if you do the work well, you're well represented, you take care, you keep your eye on the ball, you own your work to the extent that you have some control over media, you make money off of that. Just focus on the work, and the rest of it will fall in line, but make sure you're prepared for that when it happens, right? So Ignition is appealing to me, A, because I'm friends with all those guys and I've been involved in the process of the company, but they're trying to do so many of the things that I've been specific about, and they can afford to run the business well. That's not only a no-brainer, that's the specific place that I've been looking at. I've got some things I'll be doing there too. So yeah, I'm rambling about this, but for me as a creator, and I try not to just go, oh, I'm doing fine, so fuck the rest of you, but I'm like, if I'm doing pretty well, I don't need to listen to you who are doing 5 DC books, making a lot of money, and whatever creator and work you want. I don't need to listen to you, bitch, because you need to figure out. That's what a lot of people don't understand. Ultimately, it's up to you to figure out path. And if the path exists, then stop complaining and go figure that path. Because complaining doesn't do any good. So I don't know. Maybe you can suss an answer to your question out of all of that, but you triggered me because that's exactly where I've been recently, and a conversation we've had as creators have been. So
because the book we're going to discuss is The Last Flight Out of Wichita. And when you were formulating that book, was that the idea that you brought to DSTLRY, or DSTLRY said, do you have an idea that works within our framework?
So I'll try to make this brief. So during COVID, Mac Chater, who's the artist on The Last Flight Out of Wichita, he's British. We are a perfect team together as collaborators. We have similar influences. I think he's remarkably talented. He's been around a little bit, but he didn't start doing comics, and he did a lot of movie and video game stuff. So he's the rare creator who's been around for more than 10 years who is getting better and better because he's drawing more and more comics. He hasn't drawn, like, it's not an age thing or even a veteran thing. It's just kind of people get better the more comics they do. But if you've been doing comics for 30 years, sometimes you flatten out or run out of steam. So we conceived a book starting around 2019 or 20. It was kind of a whole, and I've referenced it here and there because we were going to do it somewhere. We had it approved to do somewhere as a horror political thing. COVID hit, and we developed that book for about 3 years before we pitched it and had it picked up somewhere. But that publisher started dragging their feet because their editorial staff is too small. And I was in my personal situations were kind of chaotic and coming out of COVID, and I was just not in a good headspace for a while, and I was creatively blocked, which I've always been able to generate ideas and get enthusiastic about things. And there were a few months where I literally thought, I was like, oh, that part of my brain is gone. I've got to go. Well, I can't do anything. I don't know what I'm going to do. But I always had these loose ideas around a story, separate stories involving Wichita, Kansas, which is where I went to high school and kind of became my hometown. Kansas City's mob, some real life situations about Kansas City's mob in the 70s, and some kind of interesting factoids about the crime scene up here. I'm in Kansas City. So I'd always had these loose ideas, and literally one day, they all just tumbled in my head together. Like this whole idea it was crazy. It was like boom, boom. Within like an hour I had plotted out what still is basically the whole plot for this book. And Mac and I were kind of waiting around for this other book. And we had talked about furthering our relationship, kind of in the way Sean Phillips and Ed Brubaker have become attached at the hip, with their criminal and all that stuff, which is kind of the genre we enjoy as well. We were like, well, let's do this book and then plan a follow-up and work together and try to build a library together. So I threw this idea at him, and he responded immediately to it. And the first book I talked about, I have like a 20-page pitch for, which is, I don't recommend anyone do a 20-page pitch for anything, but your pitch is always really, the first page is really it's either going to interest them further or no, right? So my philosophy is always, if you just read the first page or two of a pitch of mine and get and see some art, you're fine. But we spent so long developing this, we built this huge world for it, right? Initially we were like, let's do 100 issues of this. And when it was approved at this publisher, it was 4 issues, which was also, all of a sudden we're like, we've got like this story and we need to tell this much of it in the hopes that we can do more. It was never a good marriage. So anyway, so we started building this idea, and it came so easily because I already had it kind of down. And then another idea. And then when I first approached Chip, he was literally like, well, what do you want to pitch? And I sent him these 2 other fully fleshed out pitches just as an example of what Mac and I were doing together. And he said, which of these would you rather do? And I said, hold on a minute. And then I sent him the longer pitch for Last Flight, which had no character design or concept art. I just attached some other pages Mac had done and then some color examples of how I thought this book should look. And literally, and this doesn't happen much either. And like Chip's super busy. It's hard. It's a small company with a lot of stuff going on. But I think he was in Anglame or something and emailed me and was like, I can't stop thinking about this specific book. Let's figure this out. And the great thing, and this is kind of funny too, they asked about how long it would take us to do. So it's 3 45-page issues, right? Which come together in basically a regular sized trade, or what would normally be like 5 or 6 regular sized issues. So he asked how long it would take us to do it. And we knew right away that Mac was going to do the art and color. So that's time consuming, and, I have to write it all. And we gave him, and Mac was like, this much time, but let's say this much to give us some cushion once the deal gets approved or whatever. Well, the way DSTLRY worked was, okay, let's figure it out. Doom, boom, deal's done. And after a couple of weeks, I was like, Mac, we got to get rolling. And this is not on Mac, but he was like, I didn't expect him to get the deal done so quick. So I've had to explain, and this is probably like a sales pitch for them, but I told Chip, I'm like, one thing you're going to have to get used to is people in comics aren't used to deals getting done in a regular time, getting paid on time. I'm like, and he would tell me, he's like, yeah, we will sign people to do a deal, and all of a sudden I'll lose them, lose their focus, and they'll be like, well, I'm drawing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles because I need the money. And they're like, we just made a deal to pay. You know what I mean? It's like, it's so unusual in comics to make a deal, honor the deal, hit deadlines that creators will, you can blame creators, but you can't take it on, faith that you're going to ever get paid on time for anything. Even if there's money, it's the craziest thing in this industry. So that was, it did meet their aesthetics, oversized pages, the filler. We kind of wanted, like, stupidly and unrealistically, we thought with this idea initially, boy, it'd be great to just do this as like a hardcover graphic novel that hit bookstores and comic shops. But, thinking about bookstores as a primary market, that's hard to do within the framework of the comic industry, just because it's hard to get people to, pay you enough money to do like 150 pages on spec and see how it does. Book publishers might be more likely anyway. But when we also realized that's part of what DSTLRY will do, is we'll have a hardcover collection, we'll have a trade paperback, it'll be targeted to different markets. It was, and it's been great. I mean, they've been better than we have. It's because he and I are doing this book, just the two of us, basically. It is, it's a process that you've got to get used to, especially coming out of, it kind of rusty in terms of hitting stuff like this. But they've been great. I mean, I can't complain at all. So it all lined up. And I mean, most publishers that are newer now don't want to do superhero books. They want to do other genre stuff. And I realize some of that is because other media is interested in it, but also superhero comics. I mean, if you love them, and I do love them, but I mean, how you can only go in circles so many times, with not saying you can't do a good version of an old thing, but it's all old things, at this point. So
now when you think about the concept from Last Flight Out of Wichita, in Solicits, the series describes the book as being set during the post-war erosion of the American dream in 1977. The two main characters are Vietnam vets, and who find themselves drawn to gambling debts and conflicts with the local underworld. When you're thinking about the vets being obviously Vietnam vets, dealing with the debts and the underworld, how much is the Vietnam being post-Vietnam vets and how they were treated post-Vietnam part of the allegory of the post-war erosion of the American dream? How does that kind of correlate with each other?
Well, what's funny is the post-war erosion of the American dream was something that Sean Edgar, who's the PR guy at DSTLRY, he basically wrote up kind of a synopsis. And it was one of the rare times where I used to do that at Image. I handled PR, so I would write up solicitation text. And he wrote that up, and I was like, that is, you absolutely nailed exactly. Like, you did it better than I did. It's, so for me, again, in a nutshell, having landed in the Midwest in the mid 80s, in Wichita specifically. Wichita is like this, it's like a punchline town, kind of like Omaha. In fact, I was just watching, some show and can't even remember what it was, but one of the lines was, send them back to Wichita. And they're like, well, they're from Fresno. Well, I can't remember what it was. And he's like, oh, Fresno, really? There was an SNL sketch a few weeks ago, set in the, like a noir thing set in a bar in the 50s. And he's like, well, I'm a salesman from Wichita, and people don't even know where Wichita is, but it's just like, when you think, if you hear the name, it seems to conjure up this kind of like mid-America, blank, nowhere, just right. But people live there, I mean, it's the largest city in Kansas. It's a city. but having kind of seen it develop, I always had in mind how it was when I got there, and how it kind of reflected this sort of Midwestern, this kind of like people that I knew in Wichita 20, 30 years ago, a lot of them are still there. And that's fine because the city's progressive. But I think if you went back 30 years ago when there wasn't much going on, you would still find people that had been there their whole lives. I mentioned Omaha. I mean, in the Midwest, there's Omaha, Little Rock, Wichita, Tulsa. There's all these towns that for years their 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 progression or depression was kind of based on the rest of the country, but because they weren't major locations, people kind of got stuck there with limited options. And I think there's something kind of compelling about telling stories about dealing with that, because you see it's an old cliched story, but people never get out of their hometown, right? And for some people that's great and they succeed and thrive. But you see a whole lot of, like, if you see a family with a lot of members, and I've seen this personally, if you see a lot of family, let's say there's 5 brothers and they're all still in their same hometown, all 5 of those brothers are not going to be thriving successes. One is going to be in and out of jail. I mean, that's guaranteed, right? You'll be in a local bar with a girlfriend or whatever, with some friends, and then some guy will come in with a ponytail and making a bunch of noise, and your date will be like, "Oh, this is my Uncle Terry," or whatever. You know what I mean? It's like, so to me, those people are kind of more interesting than the people who have just settled for a good middle class life. And I think there are more people that are frustrated and stuck. So to answer your question about the analogy, that period, especially post Vietnam, when there was no I mean, there still isn't. We still don't give any. The people who support war and the military the most are the least likely to support them when they're done. And the real shame of that is a lot of those guys go in or serve with kind of that mentality of, patriotism and support from these people that sent them there. But when they come out, they have to figure shit out on their own, right? Well, it was a lot worse in the 70s when not only did they come out of an unpopular war, they were seen as either unpleasant reminders of a dirty war that we lost and never should have been involved in, and had almost no support from anyone, beyond. And this is part of the story too. They might have had support, in the 70s. You still had guys who fought in World War II that were active. It was 30 years earlier, right? So you had guys in their 50s and late 40s, 50s that were of that generation. And so, maybe they'll lend a hand because they see a fellow veteran or whatever. But, and the Vietnam veterans still don't get, I mean, it's not just about them serving the country and everything. It's about the circumstances with which they were generally coerced to go serve the country, fully aware that guys who were, my dad was of that age, and this is no slight on him, but he was going into law school, and he got a deferment. He got married and had a family. There's nothing to say that he wouldn't have been just as, capable of taking a bullet and shooting at people, but the guys that went over there didn't have the choice generally, right? So there's so much of that and it's been well mined, but I feel like that period was a specific turning point for a lot of people and for the country. There was not a depression, but a recession. So there weren't even that many opportunities that were good. Wichita is also the heart of the aircraft industry. It's called the air capital of the world, which is ironic because it's also one of the windiest cities in the country. It's like windier than Chicago. So I'm not sure. It's flat, so you can land, but I'm not sure it's the best place for like little planes to be flying around all the time. There's a lot of tornadoes, but I've always thought Wichita, in the dead center of the country, the heart of an industry that thrives and dies, and the impact of that industry's thriving and dying impacted the entire town. And then when it occurred to me that these crime stories I wanted to tell about the Kansas City Mafia, which was a hub for mafia activity in the 70s and into the 80s, I was like, well, there's got to be a way to make those two things work together. And the crime story I had in mind for Kansas City always had it revolved around a guy flying to Vegas and back. And so since Wichita has the aircraft industry, it all just kind of came together. I was like, well, what if that guy flew into Wichita before he did this, and these guys knew that? It's like one of those things that it all kind of made sense together, and I could still tell stories about these guys. I mean, the reality of it ends because most people didn't, end up stealing money from the mob and being chased by them, but the two lead characters were in the same unit together in the service. One of them is black. He dates a Vietnamese girl. There's a very large influx of Vietnamese population in Wichita in the 70s. And I remember I had somebody from Wichita that I was asking questions about where they landed and stuff, and they were like, "Well, I'm not sure that Vietnamese girl's family would have been happy with that." And I'm like, "Well, yeah, that helps my story. You know what I mean? It's like I'm very aware of that. I mean, there's still a large Vietnamese population in Wichita. They've done very well because most of them like cloistered together, worked their asses off, saved their money, and now they get to tell their kids how bad they had it while they're paying for their college and everything. But I had an old girlfriend who told me her daughter was dating a Vietnamese guy, and his family was, even now, not on board with it. And that's not unique to that culture, but you know what I'm saying. So that's all fodder for that story, and it all reflects reality. And it's not just about a black guy dating a Vietnamese girl in the 70s. A lot of people can relate to. I mean, you hear it all the time. I mean, cultural identity is important to people for a reason, and people are protective of cultures that are diminished. So, yeah, I mean, in a sense, all of that projects into larger, realities for people. But hopefully, it adds a compelling nature to the story and some real human story, human impact to the story. So,
So,
um,
so that's the basic thrust of the story. The two main leads, the Vietnam vets. Is this a situation where it's just bad luck that they got themselves in that situation? Was it poor decision making? Are these so a fatal flaws of these individuals that cause them now to be within the crosshairs of the mob?
yeah, shortly, basically, of the two guys, one of them is, and this also is kind of a trope or a cliche, but it's also pretty true. I mean, I think anybody who doesn't always get to pick and choose their friends and associates, who is responsible and tries to do shit right, always has a friend that is irresponsible and does shit wrong. Again, it's like most, if you look at, brother siblings, you can almost always, it's rare that like, well, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, you know what I mean? There's always, well, like I was talking about, we like him, but those are the worst too, the lovable rogue, again, stereotype, but very true. I mean, that's how con men exist, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so yeah, the one guy with a girlfriend is trying to make shit work, correctly, but he's working at the airport doing as a baggage handler, and he knows better than what they try to do, but that's also reality, right? I mean, there's a whole lot of people who have, and if it happens to you young, you sometimes you get in a system you can't get out of, right? That's prison is, especially now with for-profit prisons. Prison is not a place to rehabilitate people. It's a place to crush hopes and dreams and kick them back into society with only what they've learned in prison, right? So he knows better, but he's got a girlfriend whose family doesn't think much of him. He's trying his ass off to get where he wants to go. He knows what he needs to get there. He doesn't think it's part of it is that they think they can get away with it, which is also the underlying, reality of a lot of things, right? And they probably could have, but because it's going to happen at the airport and he works at the airport, his partner, who is also equally desperate, he has a better job. He's a welder, but he doesn't show up at work on time. He takes for granted that the union is going to protect him, right? But he's on thin ice. His girlfriend is sick of his bullshit. So he will just grab at, right? So when the two of them go in on this, the problem is that the guy who had the plan that works relies on the guy who has impulse issues to make it work, and he fucks it up so badly. And the real key to the story is that what they thought they were doing is only like the tip of an iceberg, right? I don't want to give too much of the story away, but that's where it shifts. Instead of just taking this and walking away, it turns out they take something else, and then and not only do they get it, the guy they take it. I mean, so it leads to this whole unraveling where attention they didn't think would even be attracted becomes completely focused on them. But yeah, it's definitely a character flaw. It's two character flaws. One guy makes a bad decision that he thinks won't hurt anyone that he can get away with, and he also has his friend who always makes bad decisions and doesn't give a shit if he can get away with it, because he, and I also think one of the reasons it works in that era is because if you were a Vietnam vet in a recession with, with a skill set that lends itself to an industry that rises and falls, what are you going to do? I mean, you can't condone crime, but I mean, not to sound like an Occupy Wall Street person, but I think by now we know the real criminals are the ones keeping all the money and forcing other people, to get by on bullshit. I mean, if it's just one form of crime or another, right? Problem is, it's a lot easier to take this one dude who did this very visible thing, and nobody gives a shit if you throw. So yeah. So basically, that's that.
So there's also one of the groups in the comic book, which is apparently historically accurate, which I never heard of before, the Purple Capsule Gang. So who are they? Why do they sound like someone I should have heard of, but I haven't?
I don't think you've heard of it because it's a Midwestern Kansas City thing. I mean, people fall into the perception is generally reality, and all you hear about the mob is the East Coast, which for good reason. Generally the mob started in Italian communities in the East Coast, and then it came to Vegas because Bugsy Siegel was so batshit crazy. They sent him out to L.A. That's how he got to L.A. And he actually did all right there. Then they sent him to Vegas. They're like, go to the desert and build hotels, and he's like, okay, and did, right? So Vegas is and so people don't think about the Midwest, but the Midwest Kansas City was kind of the Midwestern hub for the mob, so to speak. I mean, they're still active. I hope they don't come after me, but so there was Kansas City, there was Detroit, the big Midwestern cities, and they were all sort of different families, but they all had a relationship. So they had their hands in the same pies, basically. Well, the Purple Capsule Gang, technically they're more of like more like 50s through the late 60s, early 70s. By the time the story sets, they would have been the legal system had kind of taken them out of the picture to a large degree. But what was interesting about it was a black crime family, and basically it's black mafia, right? Well, they sold heroin capsules that were purple. And so their nickname, and I've heard this, I know it was Kansas City, but I've also heard the same reference in Detroit into the 70s. So that was kind of like the colloquial nickname, Purple Capsule Gang. And what was interesting about the Black Kansas City mob is that they had white leadership. There was a white guy who was like technically the head of that, which is apparently that's the only time that's ever been the case, is that a white guy, so kind of knowing that, I did a little more research, and the standard white Kansas City mafia did have a relationship with the black mafia, to the point that there were hits carried out on enemies of the regular Kansas City mob that were apparently taken out by members of the black mafia. It was kind of like, well, part of it was they're selling heroin in predominantly black or underclass areas of the city, and the Kansas City mob realizes, well, it's a lot easier if we're working with the guys that are doing, that are there, than if we're, and so they had this relationship. So it's true, and I extract, if you're involved in the late 60s, early 70s, specifically in that organization, and even if the law has come in and kind of neutered you, you're still in that life, you're still active, you're still associated with these guys who are still active, right? The Kansas City Mafia didn't go down until the early 80s as a result of the crux of this story. The event in this story that these guys take advantage of is how the FBI and the KBI took down the Kansas City mob. They never took guys down for, the murders and all this, right? It was always illegal business activities here, or tax evasion or whatever, right? So I really wanted to kind of reference those guys and bring them in and kind of play around with, and Black culture in the 70s is fun. It's, that was when Black culture kind of surged to the forefront to a large degree, and, disco and everything, blaxploitation, so without ever being cartoonish about it, the story, I wanted a little more, God help me for saying this, but a little more soul. But anyway, I also find all those relationships interesting. That's one of the reasons I wanted to have a supporting character that was Vietnamese, because that reflects so often, even now, you see stories that are centered on, like, I've seen, there was a season of Fargo, but even there was a TV movie, like, people will tell stories about 70s crime with, Black folks, and it'll be all centric on, it's like, well, nobody got along without, and it wasn't always antagonistic to the core. Kansas City's really fascinating. I won't get into it much more because I want to tell more stories about Kansas City's history, but the relationship between the Black community, the mob, and the government in Kansas City has always been intermingled because of the people at the top's understanding that they needed everybody's cooperation to hold on to power. That goes back to, in the 20s, Kansas City didn't acknowledge prohibition. It was a wide open gambling jazz town, right? Well, you can't get people to spend money and listen to jazz music if you're not incorporating the Black community, right? So Black leadership, anyway, it's really fascinating, and it's really not stories that have been told with all perspectives in mind. So
So
that's where I
for
wanted to go.
so for the listeners, when is the first issue of Last Flight Out of Wichita going to come out? How is it, monthly for the next 3 issues, or is it what's the publishing? When can they expect it?
It looks like it's going to be the end of January, early February, and then it'll probably be more like a month and a half between issues, I think. I'm not sure. It's been so long since I've paid that much attention to Diamond solicitations, but but it's 3 issues, so they're 45 pages, so it'll take you a while to read it anyway, and then at the end of that, we'll hopefully get collections out and everything. But I think it's already been solicited, so and also, anybody who's listening, check out the DSTLRY, which is DSTLR, DSTLRY. There's no vowels in there. Which a lot of people whine about, but they're talking about it. So, but go to their website, DSTLRY. They've got a great website that's really interactive. People can order things directly from them. They can figure out what comic shops to find stuff at. They've got cool merchandise. One of the cool things about DSTLRY being kind of a two-man shop with a great staff around them is that they can make decisions together and kind of just do shit that they want to try and see what's fun. And I love that about that company. So even if you don't read my book, go to the DSTLRY website and just check it out, poke around, and kind of see how they're doing things. But that's, they have a mailing list. You can get updated with that. I have a mailing list that I'm trying to be more active with. So, and that's just the tip of the iceberg for what I have. A very busy 2 years plotted out already. And then Mac and I have that book I was talking about earlier, the horror thing. We pulled it from that publisher, and now we have an expanded green light to do at least 12 issues and beyond of that. So that will be kind of a major, so to speak, work, I hope, to follow this. And, we have more crime ideas too, but these are the two things we're focused on now. So that's where we'll be.
Well, like I said, Last Flight Out of Wichita sounds absolutely awesome. When you're ready to talk about the horror book, come back on, and we'll definitely do that. And also bring we can also have Matt come on as well. We're gonna have both of you guys. So absolute honor to speak with you, sir. And like I said, the book sounds awesome, and I would love to talk about the hard book when that one's ready to come out.
Sure. Thanks for listening.
No problem. Have a fantastic night, sir.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Vertical Stars podcast. Please like and subscribe. Return for the next episode when Gianni DiCenzo boards the mothership to discuss Cobra Kai. Your next voyage, travel on.